Those of you that have been to our events in the past have probably sat in on a few of Ted's presentations. One of the foremost architectural historians around, headed up many organizations and so forth. But he's a real warrior. So he's going to be giving a presentation with a broken jaw that's tied together. And his sister is here to help interpret or translate for him. But thank God we have the speaker. So Ted, thank you very much.
Hopefully this is well, I'm going to bring your screen down. I'm going to turn the lights on. It's all right.
No, he's using it.
He's using it. Is he plugged in?
But that's, no, use the mic too, Ted. Use the
Use
mic
this
too.
also. Use both.
Stereo.
Orange better.
Surround sound.
Oh, yes, it's interesting. It's kind of like ventriloquist act. I broke both mandibular joints this week, 4 days ago. So I suggest not doing a face plant. I'm not doing a face plant in any parking lot in town. Would be the thing to do. Anyway, so if it's a little difficult to understand what I'm saying, then okay, good. It's like what'll appear though is that since our family is from the East Coast, you can kind of seem like you're going back the 400 years that we've been here, and now we're talking like we're, directly from Boston. So it's frightening, trust me. It really is. I was really fortunate because Wallace, Neff, Jr., I first met him in 1986 when I started working on Wallace Neff houses. And the only houses I'm showing you today are houses that I know about. And I know about a lot of Neff's work because I do deal with a lot of historic properties throughout America. But because of the focus for this today of us on Neff, I really wanted to only go through the houses that I've been through. So we'll just go kind of quickly on this, and then you can ask the questions that you might want to ask about it. Normally, I don't even bring notes to talks I give, as you all know if you've been to my talks. But today I brought notes, just in case I black out again. Then we have something to kind of remember. So anyway.
Ted, bring the mic really close.
Okay, I'm not going to suck on a mic today.
No, we shouldn't have to. We just have to listen.
Everybody can just listen. That's all I have to do. Trust me. This is my third lecture this week, so I pretty much know what I'm doing. So. Anyway, let's see. This is a really good quote. I just built California houses for California people, which is exactly what Wallace said. And that truly is one of the focuses of his work. And that's one of the things that makes it very, very different. Because what Wallace Neff was interested in, he was from California, a California family. And his background related to Rand McNally. Those were part of his family. And so that connection, the very deep connection throughout America for his family, and then for his wife's family, is very, very important. Because that led, really, to the types of jobs he could get. And so his wife, one of her relatives, and what her family was from, was Libby, the canned food people who basically invented canned foods for America. So they were both from, I wouldn't say they were particularly rich, but they were very socially rich. And that made a huge difference in the type of clients that they could have. Many of their family members had a lot of money, and so even when they moved out here, he was born in La Mirada in California, and they lived on a very, very large ranch there, really beautiful, citrus grove type ranch. But it's an interesting history of his. So next, let's see what we got here. we don't have to read that text. This is from the book, which is fascinating about Neff. But what I wanted to show was the time that he spent over in Europe, you know, which was a very big deal back at that time. You know, you do your golden tour when you were very young, as a teenager and when you're in college. He was based out of Switzerland and did a whole bunch of work there while he was studying before he came back to America and finished his college degree at MIT. But these renderings that he was doing while he was in college of what he was seeing in Europe is pretty amazing. And the quality, you can kind of see what inspired a lot of his work, which was very popular at that time. But when he got married, we can go to the next slide. I'm not showing pictures of his wife. What he did was, he got married, he honeymooned in Havana, which was very popular at that time. And what he did was he took a ton of photographs of Havana and other parts of Cuba and tons of renderings of this stuff. And some of the major things that he discovered that he ended up using in his work here in California, which, you know, many times from a historical standpoint, people look at his work and say, oh, he's kind of taking the romance of French Normandy architecture and the romance of Spanish colonial architecture and reproducing it in California, when in fact that's not what he was doing. And when you start to look at the basis for his work, the things that he got in Cuba and also in North Africa was a big part of it, because that whole Moroccan architecture, which is really the driver of Spanish style architecture, he was rooted in that. And so when you look at things like the blue doors and blue rafter tails that he painted on his houses, a lot of that came directly from Cuba. And some of the things that we'll see, I just want to mention it right now, we'll look at it in a couple of the pictures. These kind of alcoves where the automobiles drive through to enter the courtyard of the houses, that was from a direct photograph he took in Cuba, because that was amazing to him that he saw these kind of paths through a two-story building where automobiles and carts and horses would come through to a relatively small-scale residence. And that part's a little bit interesting. Now, these stables for Edward Drummond Libby, now that's not his Libby family. His wife's Libby does not have the E on it. Edward Drummond Libby is a different Libby connection, who came out to California when he wasn't feeling particularly well, like so many people did at that time. And he loved what he found in Ojai and started master developing it. So the main street in Ojai that was developed by Libby, of course the Ojai Valley Inn, and Neff worked on a bunch of this. And the Libby Ranch, there were quite a few buildings he did in that time. And this is one of the stables that he did. And this was one of the first buildings I visited when, of course, a celebrity client had the property. Later on, it recently sold because Reese Witherspoon bought it and then restored it again a second time. So it is a very interesting house. There's a pretty decent view if you go into the Oaks area of Ojai, where the original ranch was. It's quite nice. But even if you look this up online, even the real estate listing photos that are on there right now related to the Witherspoon sale is actually quite good. It's a good way to look at this property, because what it really does is, and what's really important about Neff's work, it's very, very different than the type of architecture that's done today throughout America, is the proportion issue. And so even though some of these buildings look quite grand, and we look at this, and if somebody were going to be building this house in Laguna Beach, the front door in the same rendering would be 12 feet tall, right? But in this house, it is not. So horses that had to go into the stables there on the left and right, the horses actually had to duck their heads under the beam to get into this space. And that's what's really, really critical about understanding Neff's work. Because when you see the photos or the renderings, you might think, wow, it's such a grand mansion. But when you actually see the building, and you see actual photographs of it, let's say, with people standing near them, it's much, much smaller scale, but much more appropriate to us as people. in relating to the space. So let's move on. The Ojai Hotel, which was proposed, the tower was a straight copy of a Moroccan tower there that was built. The hotel was eventually built, but it wasn't done because the company collapsed, Edward Libby, the company had collapsed, and so they had to bring in somebody else to do it. One of the things that's a little bit wishy-washy though is the Ojai Valley Hotel. They still try to tell you that Wallace Neff designed it, even though he didn't. It wasn't his design, and it was another architect who did it, another builder. But perhaps he was somewhat inspired. There's some components to the hotel that are similar to this, but not quite the same as what was going on here. But this is a beautiful rendering, of course, in your book. But the architecture is quite interesting. So let's go to the next one here. This was one of the very first houses that he did that was a real residence. And he went back to that French Normandy kind of feel. And what's really interesting about this particular house is these very tall V action that you see in the roof, particularly there on the right. On the interior of the house, that's actually the exposed roof. So when you go into the spaces, even though the doors are relatively short compared to what we have today, when you get into those spaces, it's like the spaces kind of explode. So everything seems bigger and taller and grander than most big, tall, and grand houses that you might see throughout the Southern California coastline. And that's a very, very important proportional issue that was very important for Neff and very attractive when people were actually experiencing the houses. This house still exists. It's in very good condition, and it's a great place. It's been well restored. Okay. This is another great house. If you go to the Huntington Library, which you're talking about related to the collection, this house is not that far from it, and it's relatively easy to see. The scale of this, again, is dramatic in that the house seems so much larger from the street. But if you actually walk up to the front door, suddenly the house feels more personal in its scale. And that's really nice. Something very different that he did in this house is the living room, the fireplace is actually a corner fireplace. It's probably one of the only of the 600 houses that he did where he actually had the main living room fireplace as a corner fireplace. It was quite different. It's very kind of the house, like many of his houses, feel like they've evolved over time related to design. And this one does a very good example of that at Parkerton's residence. Okay. Now, Francis Marion and Fred Thompson, of course, were major celebrities at the time. They did tons of entertaining at their house. This was the largest house that had been built in Beverly Hills in Los Angeles up to that time, and it was the first major commission, of course, for Neff. And you can see over there on the left that drive-through that he had seen when they were in Cuba. And that's how you actually enter the property. So when you come up the driveway, a fairly long driveway, up to the property, you then come through that area